Otto von Bismarck was perhaps one of the greatest statesmen to ever live, but his policies were not always flawless, and this was especially true in the case of the Kulturkampf. The Kulturkampf was a period of intense hostility between the German Empire and the Roman Catholic Church, usually demarcated between the years 1871 and 1878. The word itself roughly translates to culture struggle, and that's precisely what it was. The Kulturkampf wasn't a war over territory or resources per se, but instead a wrestle for control over the educational and religious structures of the German Empire. As we'll see, Bismarck's motivations for initiating the Kulturkampf were rather complex, but his nominal objective was the destruction of Germany's Centre Party, also known as Das Zentrum. The Centre Party had become a powerful political force within the Imperial Reichstag, and Bismarck saw its proximity to the Catholic Church as highly threatening to the consolidation of his nascent empire. In lockstep with his liberal allies, he thus sought to destroy the party and neuter any influence the Catholic Church might have over German politics. This had limited success. While on the one hand, Bismarck succeeded in limiting the influence of the Church over the affairs of the state, the Kulturkampf alienated a huge proportion of Germany's Catholic population, who responded in kind by supporting the Centre Party. Thus, by 1874, the party had doubled its vote and become the second largest in the Reichstag. This embarrassed Bismarck, who was forced to walk back many of the policies administered by both the Reichstag and the Prussian Landtag throughout this period. Thus, a series of questions lie before us. How did the empire go about waging its Kulturkampf? Why were its measures unsuccessful? What were its long-term side effects? And what truly motivated it in the first place? To answer these questions, we first need to familiarize ourselves with Germany's political circumstances in the late 19th century. The German Empire came into existence on the 18th of January 1871, shortly after Prussia's victory over France in the Franco-Prussian War. The southern German states, save for Austria and Liechtenstein, agreed to unify with Prussia, and at the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, King Wilhelm I was proclaimed Kaiser, or Emperor of the German Reich. Concordantly, Otto von Bismarck, who was the minister-president of Prussia, became the empire's first chancellor. In practice, this put him in charge of running the German state. Prior to unification, Bismarck had played a formative role in strengthening Prussia's position in Europe. He had successfully engineered 3 wars against Denmark, Austria, and finally France, which taken together had galvanized the non-Prussian German states into unification. With the German Empire created, Bismarck's core priority became the consolidation of his imperial government and the maintenance of peace abroad. This question of consolidation was more quarrelsome than some may think. Bavaria and Baden had only joined the empire reluctantly, and both remained skeptical of Prussia's dominant role within it. Indeed, loyalty across the board was initially delicate, and many states maintained a much stronger sense of regional loyalty. This problem had a particularly strong religious dimension, with the Catholic-Protestant split serving as a dangerous fracture line along which the nascent empire may be divided. The merger of Prussia with the southern German states had seen the Protestant share of the population diluted down to 62%, while the Catholic share had risen to 36%. Naturally, this was a consequence of the empire's demographic split. While Prussia and central Germany were mostly Protestant, the kingdoms of Baden and Bavaria, as well as the recently annexed Alsace-Lorraine, were overwhelmingly Catholic. What's more, the eastern states of the empire, namely Posen, Silesia, and Western Prussia, had large Polish minorities who were also Catholic. This Polish vector to political Catholicism was particularly unsettling to Bismarck, who feared that the church was using religion to fan the flames of Polish independence. But political anxiety cut both ways. Poles, and Catholics more broadly, felt a deep-seated insecurity in the overwhelmingly Protestant, Prussian-dominated German Reich. This fueled the growth of the Catholic-denominated Centre Party in the Reichstag. Now, I will refrain here from discussing the German Empire's constitution in great detail, but suffice it to say that the Reichstag was a parliament with some limited, albeit significant powers. It couldn't veto proclamations from the emperor and had almost no sway over matters in defense and foreign policy, but it did control the budget and was responsible for passing laws. While the chancellor was appointed by the emperor and couldn't be deposed by the Reichstag, in practice he still relied on their support in administering government. As such, Bismarck sought to forge coalitions which could be reconciled with his foreign and domestic political objectives. In this vein, he viewed the rise of the Centre Party as highly threatening to the empire's integrity. The Centre was practically joined at the hip with the Catholic Church, and Bismarck feared that they sought to use it as a means of undoing the empire he had worked so hard to create. That may sound paranoid and even a bit conspiratorial, but Bismarck did have good reasons for believing this. To understand why, we need to enumerate over some important history. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, the Catholic Church saw its power in Europe decline significantly. The Enlightenment and its child liberalism had penetrated deep within Northern and Central Europe. This was especially pronounced in Great Britain and Northern Germany, where the Church's influence suffered the most. More importantly, though, the rise of nationalism seriously throttled its authority in state affairs. This would contour its relations with the major European powers in the forthcoming years. Indeed, following the French Revolution, France had embarked on a decidedly secular path, which subordinated the Church to the power of the state. A similar pattern followed in the cases of Italy and Germany, both of whom developed highly antagonistic relationships with the Church. Italy completed its unification in 1861, a process which the Catholic Church intensely opposed. The loss of its temporal power made it so bitter that it actively encouraged Catholics to boycott Italian politics. The Church's hostility towards Germany, on the other hand, was perhaps even more serious. Prior to unification, it had sided against Prussia in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. It then sided against Prussia again in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. And as with Italy, it opposed German unification in 1871, fearing the further erosion of its influence over the state. Beyond this, both German nationalists and liberals had other reasons to be distrustful. In 1864, the Catholic Church published its Syllabus Aurorum, which condemned 80 political and philosophical positions as false. These were mainly based on the foundations of the modern nation-state, and they included freedom of religion, separation of church and state, and the sovereignty of the people. Several years later, in July of 1870, Pope Pius IX convened the First Vatican Council, in which the dogma of papal infallibility was proclaimed. This meant that on matters of faith and morals, the Pope was considered to be incapable of error. This was seen as highly subversive in Germany, since it elevated loyalty to the Church above that of the nation and state. In this vein, the conservative and liberal parties of the Reichstag viewed the Centre's support for the Pope as highly provocative. Bismarck would have none of it, and by the end of 1871, the stage was set for a showdown. The Kulturkampf officially began on December 10, 1871, with the passing of the Pulpit Law. This was effectively a censorship law which forbade clerics across the German Empire from discussing political affairs in their sermons. The maximum penalty for doing so was 2 years imprisonment. Shortly thereafter, in January of 1872, Bismarck appointed the liberal Adalbert Volk to serve as Prussian Minister for Religion, Education, and Health. Volk would ultimately become the driving force behind the Kulturkampf laws, and his approach would starkly divide the empire's population. His first piece of legislation was the School Supervision Act, a major piece of the Kulturkampf which cleared the Reichstag in March of 1872. This law abolished church oversight of the Prussian school system, which effectively excluded the clergy from education. Hitherto, both Catholic and Protestant churches had played a major role in formulating the curriculum of German schools. This law put the German education system under the exclusive control of the Imperial government. The School Supervision Act was then followed by the Jesuit law in July. For context, the Jesuits were a sect of Catholics sent abroad to practice in foreign dominions. They were intensely loyal to the Pope, and in the 19th century they were known for propagating a doctrine called ultramontanism, a form of papal supremacy. The Jesuit law banned their institutions and forced many of them to either flee or be expelled from the German Empire. At this point, the Kulturkampf was beginning to escalate in intensity and bitterness. This would reach its apex with the Folklaws of May 1873. The Folklaws involved 4 distinct pieces of legislation which attempted to limit the church's power in a number of ways. The first law put further controls on the clergy. It mandated that only German citizens could take up ecclesiastical positions within the empire, and placed a number of hurdles before them. For example, priests were required to have a degree from a German gymnasium and 3 years of theological study at a German university. Now, given the predominance of Protestant liberalism within the German higher education system, this practically guaranteed that the future priesthood would be both secular and loyal to the German Empire. Finally, as if that wasn't enough, they also had to pass a state examination before being accepted into the clergy. In the Protestant Church, these measures had been in place for some time, so they only really affected the Catholic Church. The remainder of the Folklaws were just as intense. The second inhibited the Catholic Church's disciplinary proceedings. It did this by establishing the Royal Court of Justice for Ecclesiastical Affairs, a special court which was given jurisdiction over church officers in violation of state laws. The third law further restricted the exercise of ecclesiastical punishments and the means by which discipline could be directed against German citizens. Specifically, it banned excommunication, meaning that the church's disciplinary methods were now completely restricted to the spiritual domain. Conversely, the fourth law made it easier for Germans to leave the church. It allowed a person to sever his connection with the church by a simple declaration before a civil judge. This in turn liberated him from all civil effects of belonging to a church, including ecclesiastical burdens and financial debts. By now, you're probably wondering how all of this was being received by Germany's Catholic population. Well, put simply, they were furious, and it didn't take long for their energy to be converted into political capital. In the state elections of November 1873, the Centre Party grew from 50 to 90 seats in the Bundesrat, and in the Reichstag elections from 63 to 91. The number of Catholic periodicals also increased dramatically. In fact, by 1873, there were about 120 across the empire. Thus, even in its early stages, there were clear signs that Bismarck's strategy was beginning to backfire. By April 1874, he had already begun to shift the blame to his colleagues. He remarked to a Saxon minister, quote, "I wanted to fight the centre as a political party, nothing more. If they, the ministers, had limited themselves to that, it would certainly have been successful. I am completely blameless for the fact that they went further and aroused the whole Catholic population." On July 13th, 1874, tensions reached a fever pitch. A Catholic radical named Eduard Kullman attempted to assassinate Bismarck and end the Kulturkampf. He failed though, only managing to shoot Bismarck in the hand before being arrested. Kullman later cited the church laws as the reason for his attempt on the Chancellor's life, and was subsequently sentenced to 14 years in a correctional facility with harsh forced labor. The assassination attempt only led to an intensification of the Kulturkampf. On February 5th, 1875, the Catholic Church declared the Folklaws to be invalid, quote, "insofar as they totally oppose the divine order of the Church." On April 22nd, the last major law of the Kulturkampf was passed, the Prussian Payment Law. The Payment Law ended government subsidies and payments to Catholic bishops and priests unless they signed a declaration of adherence to all previous laws, in effect strong-arming the remaining dissidents into submission. At this stage, nearly all German bishops, clergy, and laymen rejected the legality of the laws and were defiantly facing the penalties, trials, and imprisonments which accompanied them. As of 1878, only 3 of 8 Prussian dioceses still had bishops. Nearly a quarter of the parishes were vacant, and up to 1,800 priests had ended up in jail or exile. Nearly half the monks and nuns had left Prussia, and a third of the monasteries and convents were also closed. Meanwhile, the Centre Party had doubled its popular vote to become the second largest party in the Reichstag, where it would remain a powerful force for the next 60 years. Bismarck had unintentionally manifested the precise opposite of what he intended, so much so that it was becoming difficult for him to run the government without the Centre Party's support. Something needed to change. From 1878 onwards, Bismarck began walking back the Kulturkampf. He had become deeply uncomfortable with its growing ferocity, and insofar as the separation of church and state were concerned, he had achieved more than what he wanted. At this stage, Bismarck began to perceive a far greater threat in the form of the Social Democrats, whose platform he saw as far more threatening to the empire and its ruling class. He also saw increasing economic threats from Russia and the United States, whose grain exports were threatening German agriculture. Therefore, in search of support for his anti-socialist laws and protectionist trade measures, he turned his back on the liberals and began looking for opportunities to end the Kulturkampf. The death of Pope Pius IX in February of 1878 paved the way for a settlement with the Catholic Church. His successor, Leo XII, proved to be pragmatic and conciliatory. Bismarck and the new pope soon entered into direct negotiations, but these were not immediately successful. It was only after the resignation of Adalbert Falk in July of 1879 that negotiations finally broke through. The church had nothing but utter contempt for Falk, and his resignation was interpreted as a peace offering by the Vatican. A compelling revival to the peace talks arrived when they agreed to a civic registry of clerics in February of 1880. The Kulturkampf gradually wound down with the passing of various mitigation laws throughout the forthcoming decade. The first such mitigation law was in 1880, and it re-allowed government payments to Prussian dioceses and freed the bishops from swearing allegiance to the Prussian laws. Shortly thereafter, 4 new bishops were installed whose positions had been left vacant after the death of the incumbents. Catholic associations involved in the care of the infirm were also readmitted. In 1882, the state of Prussia and the Vatican formally resumed diplomatic relations, which had been broken off in 1872. In that same year, the second mitigation law allowed the waiver of government exams for clerics. In 1883, the third mitigation law legalized all religious actions of bishops, and in certain cases, the king could pardon deposed bishops. 280 expelled clerics were also pardoned. In 1886, the first peace law passed, which amended the regulations in the Education Standards and the Civic Registry Law of May 1873. Here, state exams for clerics were totally abolished. And finally, the state acknowledged papal disciplinary powers and abolished the Royal Court of Justice for ecclesiastical affairs. In 1887, the second peace law readmitted all orders except the Jesuits to Prussia. And with that, the Kulturkampf effectively came to an end. In May of that year, the Pope declared, quote, "The struggle which damaged the Church and was of no good to the state is now over." While key regulations and laws concerning the separation of church and state remained, the mitigation and peace laws restored the inner autonomy of the Catholic Church, thereby ending the struggle. While the Church's political power and influence had significantly subsided, the growth of the Centre Party was a major setback for Bismarck, one which he never publicly conceded. In this connection, a deeper look at his motivations are well warranted. As we've already discussed, his nominal objective for instigating the Kulturkampf was the elimination of Germany's Centre Party, a political faction which he perceived as being a long-term threat to the sovereignty of the empire. But there were probably deeper layers to this. Historian Otto Pflanze argues that Bismarck's motivations for waging the Kulturkampf were indeed more complex and multifaceted. At its core was a conviction that Prussia was the subject of a malevolent crusade on the part of the Catholic Church. In his mind, their goal was the domination of all governments, particularly the Hohenzollern monarchy, which was the chief Protestant power in Europe. But in addition to this was his general aim of consolidation. In this sense, the Kulturkampf was intimately related to all of Bismarck's other foreign and domestic political objectives during the period, namely the reconstruction of the Eastern Alliance, collaboration with the liberal and conservative parties, the Germanization of ethnic minorities, especially in Poland, the development of Reich institutions, and so on. Seen in this light, the Kulturkampf's objectives of eliminating the center, liquidating clerical influence within the Prussian government, and rupturing the relationship between Polish nationalists and the clergy perfectly complemented his broader aims of consolidation. So how did it go so wrong? Well, the central answer to that question lies in Bismarck's collaboration with the liberals. Without a doubt, German liberals had been the driving force behind the Kulturkampf. They were incensed by the church's reactionary, anti-Enlightenment ideals and sought not only to roll back the center, but Catholicism in general. Bismarck had sanctioned it and was certainly complicit, but in reality he delegated the specificities to them. This was particularly true in the case of the folklores, which were surely the most radical and far-reaching of their time. Indeed, this gave German liberals license to extend the parameters of the Kulturkampf well beyond Bismarck's desired domain. Another point worth emphasizing here is that it was not only the harshness of the laws which galvanized the Catholic population, but also the ferocity of their enforcement. Between 1872 and 1878, dozens of Catholic newspapers were confiscated, Catholic associations and assemblies were dissolved, and Catholic civil servants were dismissed merely on the pretense of having papal sympathies. Thousands of lay people were imprisoned for assisting priests to evade the punitive new laws. If the Kulturkampf had simply been enforced less stringently, then perhaps the Centre Party would not have realized the kind of gains that it made in the 1874 and 1878 elections. So the general ideological enthusiasm among the liberals in waging the Kulturkampf was a major factor in its failure. Another relevant question here though is why Bismarck let it go on for so long. By 1874 it was clear that the Kulturkampf was backfiring. The priesthood were defiantly rejecting the new laws and the Centre Party was consolidating an even stronger position within the Reichstag. Perhaps Bismarck was simply limited by the political realities of his time. By 1874, the Liberals held 37% of all seats in the Reichstag, while the Centre held 22%. Bismarck had other policy agendas which he was pursuing, so he needed the support of at least one of these two parties. Perhaps after 1874, he still assessed the Liberals to be the lesser of the two evils, and thus resigned himself to a more radical feud with the Catholic Church. Still, Bismarck probably deserves some portion of the blame for the Kulturkampf's failure. From the very outset, he had underestimated the tenacity with which persecuted men cling to their ideals, and by 1878, this misjudgment had become abundantly clear. This was a critical lesson Bismarck would learn from in his subsequent showdown with the Social Democrats. Ironically, the most significant long-term effect of the Kulturkampf was the mobilization of Catholic voters through the Centre Party, or in other words, the exact opposite of what it was supposed to achieve. This mobilization proved incredibly resolute. In fact, electoral data from the later Weimar Republic showed that it was actually in the Catholic strongholds of the Centre Party that the Nazis performed the worst. It is doubtful whether such a commitment on the part of Catholics would have remained without the Kulturkampf. Of course, the ability of the Church to directly influence state policy never fully recovered, but its position arguably fared much worse in Great Britain, where it was almost completely wiped out. In closing, I think one of the key lessons of the Kulturkampf is the riskiness of political repression. It may be easy to pull off against a small and isolated minority, but against 1/3 of a country's population, such approaches have a very strong chance of backfiring if they aren't executed correctly. And that's exactly what happened with the Kulturkampf. The radical impulses of the liberals were allowed to extend well beyond the parameters Bismarck was comfortable with. This caused the Kulturkampf to metastasize into a much nastier conflict than would have otherwise been the case, one which would leave a sustained impact on the empire's politics.